Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're stepping into one of Padre Pio's most unsettling visions, and if you've been following these stories, you know he rarely spoke about encounters that left him shaken. Most of his mystical experiences brought comfort, hope, messages of mercy, reaching even the darkest corners of the human heart. But this vision was different. It revealed something that haunted him for years afterward. The tragic fate of a soul who appeared devout, who followed all the right practices, who looked holy to everyone around him, but whose heart had quietly drifted into spiritual emptiness. If you're new here, this channel explores the hidden revelations Padre Pio experienced, the visions that pulled back the veil between our world and eternity, the encounters that showed him truths most of us never see until it's too late. And if these mysteries fascinate you the way they fascinate me, make sure you subscribe, because we uncover one of these incredible accounts every week. This particular story began on a winter evening in San Giovanni Rotondo, when Padre Pio was praying his usual vigil before the Blessed Sacrament. The monastery was silent except for the gentle flicker of candles and the whispered prayers that echoed softly through the chapel. He had been in deep meditation for several hours when something shifted in the atmosphere around him. Not a sound, not a movement, but a presence that made the air feel heavier, colder, charged with an energy that wasn't entirely peaceful. Padre Pio lifted his eyes slowly, and there before him stood a figure that would change his understanding of spiritual danger forever. It was a man dressed respectably, cleanly, the kind of person you might see in the front pew every Sunday morning. His clothes spoke of someone who cared about appearances, who wanted to be seen as proper, as righteous, as someone who had their spiritual life in perfect order. But something about his expression immediately troubled Padre Pio. There was a stillness to him that felt unnatural, a confidence that seemed somehow hollow. The man approached Padre Pio not with the humility that marked most souls who appeared in these visions, but with a certain expectation, almost as if he deserved recognition for his faithfulness. He began to speak, and his words revealed the heart of a tragedy that Padre Pio said was more common than anyone realizes. The man listed his religious accomplishments like credentials. He attended Mass every Sunday without fail. He gave generously to church collections. He was respected in his community as a moral, upstanding citizen. He followed the commandments, avoided scandal, maintained a reputation that others admired and envied. But as he spoke, Padre Pio began to see something that filled him with deep sorrow. Surrounding this soul was not the light that typically accompanied the faithful, but a subtle darkness. Not the violent, obvious darkness of rebellion or hatred, but something far insidious. It was the darkness of spiritual complacency, of a heart that had mistaken routine for relationship, performance for conversion, appearance for authenticity. The man looked at Padre Pio with genuine confusion. He couldn't understand why he wasn't being welcomed into glory, why there seemed to be no light waiting for him, why his years of faithful church attendance hadn't automatically secured his place in heaven. And that confusion, Padre Pio later explained, was itself the revelation. This soul had lived his entire life believing that salvation was something he could earn through external practices, something he deserved because of his religious consistency. Padre Pio asked him gently, "But did you love God?" The question seemed to catch the man off guard. He stammered for a moment, then replied with something that broke Padre Pio's heart. "I followed all the rules," he said. "I did everything I was supposed to do." But when pressed again about love, about surrender, about whether his heart had ever truly opened to God, the man fell silent. That silence revealed everything. This was a soul who had attended church, but never encountered Christ, who had prayed words, but never poured out his heart, who had given money, but never given himself, who had avoided sin, but never pursued holiness. He had lived what Padre Pio called a borrowed faith, going through the motions because it was expected, because it looked good, because it made him feel secure, but never because he was desperate for God. As the vision continued, Padre Pio saw something that shook him to his core. Behind this man, a presence began to form, not dramatic like the demons he had encountered in other visions, but subtle, patient, satisfied. It was the spirit of self-righteousness, and it clung to the man like a second skin. This presence hadn't needed to tempt him into obvious sins or dramatic rebellions. It had simply convinced him that his external religious practices were enough, that God owed him salvation because of his good behavior. The man began to grow agitated as reality slowly dawned on him. "Why isn't God here for me?" he demanded. "I lived a good life. I was faithful. I was moral." But Padre Pio saw the tragic truth. This soul had spent decades in God's presence every Sunday morning, sitting in pews, reciting prayers, receiving communion. But he had never actually met God. He had been physically present, but spiritually absent, going through religious motions while his heart remained closed, proud, convinced it needed nothing. The most heartbreaking moment came when Padre Pio tried to offer him blessing, to pray for him, to intercede on his behalf. But the soul stepped back, not from hatred or rebellion, but from spiritual blindness. He genuinely didn't believe he needed forgiveness. He didn't believe he was lost. He had confused his religious activity with spiritual health, his moral behavior with heart transformation, his church attendance with genuine faith. Padre Pio later described this as one of the most terrifying encounters of his life, not because of any demonic manifestation, but because of the complete absence of spiritual hunger in this soul. He had no desire for God, no recognition of his need for mercy, no awareness that his heart had remained untouched by grace, despite years of religious practice. He had become, in Padre Pio's words, a soul without thirst in the presence of living water. The vision revealed something that Padre Pio said was happening in churches everywhere. Souls sitting in pews, following routines, maintaining appearances, but never allowing God to penetrate their hearts. They had turned faith into a performance, salvation into a transaction, and worship into a weekly obligation. They looked holy on Sundays, but the rest of their lives revealed hearts that had never truly surrendered to God. What made this encounter so devastating was not that the man was evil, but that he was convinced he was already saved. His false security had become his prison. He had built his spiritual life on sand, mistaking religious activity for genuine relationship, and now faced the crushing realization that all his years of church-going had been spiritually empty. Padre Pio watched as the man began to see glimpses of the truth, not through divine punishment, but through the simple revelation of his own heart. He saw his charity without love, his prayers without passion, his faith without surrender, his goodness without humility. He realized that he had lived his entire life believing God owed him salvation, while never once opening his heart to receive it as a gift. The darkness around him began to deepen, not because God was rejecting him, but because he had spent a lifetime rejecting the very grace that could have saved him. His pride, his self-righteousness, his spiritual complacency had created walls that even divine mercy couldn't penetrate without his permission. And that permission, that humble recognition of need, that cry for help, never came. As the reality of his situation began to dawn on him, the man's composure started to crack. Padre Pio said he watched as decades of false certainty began to crumble before his eyes. The soul had built his entire identity around being a good Catholic, a faithful churchgoer, someone who followed the rules and maintained respectability. But now, standing in the light of truth, he could see that his spiritual life had been nothing more than empty performance. The man began to protest more desperately. He reminded Padre Pio of his perfect attendance record at Mass, his generous donations, his moral reputation in the community. He spoke of how he had avoided the obvious sins that plagued others, how he had maintained his religious obligations even when it was inconvenient. But with each justification, the darkness around him seemed to grow thicker, more suffocating. Padre Pio tried to reach him one more time. He spoke gently, about mercy, about the possibility of repentance even in that moment, about God's willingness to forgive any soul that truly sought him. But the man couldn't hear it. His pride had become like a wall of stone around his heart. He had spent so many years convinced of his own righteousness that he couldn't imagine needing forgiveness. The very suggestion that he might be spiritually poor seemed offensive to him. What Padre Pio witnessed next was perhaps the most chilling part of the entire vision. The soul began to turn away, not from fear of judgment, but from wounded pride. He couldn't accept that all his religious activities meant nothing without love. He couldn't bear the thought that his carefully constructed spiritual reputation was worthless in the eyes of God. So he chose to walk away from the light rather than admit he had been wrong about everything. The presence of self-righteousness that had been hovering behind him now moved closer, wrapping around him like a cloak. Padre Pio said it wasn't dragging the man away. It didn't need to. The soul was choosing his own separation, his own isolation, his own spiritual death. He preferred the darkness of his delusions to the light that would have required him to acknowledge his need. As the vision intensified, Padre Pio saw the man beginning to fade into the shadows he had chosen. There was no dramatic struggle, no violent confrontation, no supernatural force pulling him down. Instead, there was something far more terrifying, a quiet, voluntary descent into nothingness. The soul was dissolving into the very emptiness he had cultivated within himself for years. Padre Pio cried out one last time, pleading with the man to turn back, to seek mercy, to humble himself before God. But the soul had already made his choice. He had spent a lifetime saying no to grace in small ways, and now that pattern of refusal had become his eternal identity. He could no longer hear the voice of love calling him home because he had trained himself to ignore it. The chapel fell silent as the vision ended, but Padre Pio remained on his knees for hours afterward, weeping not just for that one soul, but for all the others he knew were walking the same path. He had seen the face of the most dangerous spiritual condition of all, not open rebellion against God, but quiet, respectable, religious emptiness, the kind that fools everyone, including the person living it. In the days that followed, Padre Pio could hardly speak about what he had witnessed. The friars noticed his deep sorrow, his urgent prayers, his increased intensity when hearing confessions. He had always been compassionate towards sinners, but now he seemed almost desperate to reach souls before it was too late. He began warning people about the subtle dangers of spiritual complacency, about the difference between religion and relationship, about the deadly trap of believing yourself already saved. He told his spiritual children that the man in his vision hadn't fallen into damnation because of any great crime or obvious rebellion. He had lost his soul through 1,000 small compromises, 1,000 moments of choosing appearance over authenticity, routine over relationship, pride over humility. He had attended church faithfully, but never allowed church to change him. He had followed religious practices, but never let them lead him to God. The vision revealed to Padre Pio that hell is filled not primarily with obvious sinners, but with souls who convinced themselves they were already righteous. People who had confused external religious behavior with internal spiritual transformation. They had built their hope on their own goodness rather than on God's mercy, and that foundation had proven to be sand. Padre Pio began to understand why Jesus had been so hard on the Pharisees, why he had warned so sternly about those who appeared righteous on the outside while remaining dead within. The vision showed him that religious pride is perhaps the most deadly sin of all, because it blinds the soul to its own need for salvation. A sinner knows he needs mercy. A self-righteous person believes he deserves heaven. What haunted Padre Pio most was the realization that this tragedy was happening everywhere, in every church, in every community. Souls sitting in pews week after week, going through the motions, following the rules, maintaining their religious reputation, but never once opening their hearts to be transformed by God's love. They had turned faith into a checklist, salvation into a transaction, and worship into a weekly obligation that somehow guaranteed their eternal security. The man in his vision had been surrounded by grace his entire life. Every Sunday he had sat within feet of the Eucharist, heard the word of God proclaimed, been offered countless opportunities to surrender his heart, but he had treated each encounter with the divine as just another religious duty to fulfill, rather than an invitation to intimacy. He had been physically present, but spiritually absent, going through the motions while his heart remained untouched. Padre Pio saw how the enemy had deceived this soul not through obvious temptation, but through subtle satisfaction. Satan hadn't needed to drag him into scandalous sins or dramatic rebellions. He had simply convinced him that his external religious practices were sufficient. that God was pleased with his moral behavior, that his salvation was secure because of his faithful church attendance. The man had lived his entire life believing he was walking toward heaven while actually drifting further and further away from God. Further away from God. The most chilling part of the vision was what happened next. As the soul began to realize the emptiness of his spiritual life, something shifted in his expression. The confidence that had marked his initial appearance started to crack, replaced by a growing panic that Padre Pio said was heartbreaking to witness. The man looked around frantically, as if searching for something to justify his worthiness, some religious credential he had forgotten to mention that might change his situation. He began recounting his religious history with increasing desperation. He spoke of the rosaries he had prayed, the novenas he had completed, the religious books he had read. He mentioned his perfect record of Easter duties, his faithful observance of holy days, his reputation as someone who never missed Mass even during illness or bad weather. But with each accomplishment he listed, Padre Pio could see the growing horror in his eyes as he realized none of it mattered. The soul had confused the container with the contents, the form with the substance, the practice with the purpose. He had collected religious activities like trophies, believing they would somehow add up to salvation. But Padre Pio saw that his heart had remained completely untouched by any of it. He had been like someone who attended countless concerts but never heard the music, who sat through beautiful sunsets but never saw the beauty. What made the vision even more tragic was the gradual revelation of how this spiritual emptiness had affected every aspect of the man's life. As his false security crumbled, Padre Pio began to see glimpses of the relationships this soul had damaged through his religious pride. The family members he had judged harshly for their imperfect church attendance, the friends he had looked down upon for their struggles with faith, the opportunities for genuine love and service he had missed because he was too focused on maintaining his spiritual reputation. The man had used his religious observance as a weapon of judgment against others rather than as a bridge of compassion. He had become the kind of person who counted other people's sins while remaining blind to his own spiritual poverty. His faith had made him harder rather than softer, more judgmental rather than more merciful, more prideful rather than more humble. He had taken the beautiful gift of religion and turned it into a tool of self-righteousness. Padre Pio watched as the soul's panic intensified. The man began pleading, but not for mercy. Instead, he pleaded for recognition of his worthiness, for acknowledgement of his religious achievements, for someone to confirm that his years of faithful practice surely counted for something. Even in that moment of crisis, he couldn't humble himself enough to simply ask for forgiveness. His pride had become so deeply ingrained that he would rather argue his case than admit his need. The vision revealed something that would haunt Padre Pio for the rest of his life. This soul wasn't being rejected by God. God was there, present, offering love and mercy as he always had. But the man couldn't see it because his spiritual pride had blinded him to his own need. He had spent so many years convinced that he was already in God's favor that he couldn't recognize his desperate need for God's grace. Padre Pio tried one final time to reach him. He spoke about the thief on the cross, about the prodigal son, about Mary Magdalene, about all the souls who had found mercy not through their righteousness, but through their repentance. He begged the man to set aside his pride, to acknowledge his spiritual poverty, to cry out for the mercy that was still available to him. But the soul couldn't hear these words of hope because they required him to admit he had been wrong about everything. The presence of self-righteousness that surrounded the man began to whisper reassurances that confirmed his delusions. It told him he was indeed worthy, that his religious practices did matter, that God was being unfair in not recognizing his faithful service. These whispers fed his pride, even as they led him deeper into darkness. The enemy's greatest victory wasn't in making him sin, but in making him believe he didn't need a savior. As the vision neared its end, Padre Pio witnessed something that filled him with unspeakable sorrow. The man made his final choice. Faced with the option of humbling himself and seeking mercy or maintaining his pride and walking away from God, he chose pride. He turned his back on the light, not because it was too harsh, but because it revealed too much. It showed him the emptiness of his spiritual life, and he couldn't bear to face that truth. The soul began to move away from the presence of God, but not because he was being driven away. He was choosing separation because the alternative required a humility he had spent a lifetime avoiding. Padre Pio said it was like watching someone choose to starve rather than admit they were hungry. The man preferred the darkness of his delusions to the light that would have required him to change everything about how he saw himself. What made the scene even more heartbreaking was the silence that followed. There was no dramatic confrontation, no violent struggle, no supernatural battle, just a soul quietly choosing emptiness over fulfillment, isolation over communion, death over life. The man had been offered everything and had chosen nothing because accepting everything would have cost him his pride. The chapel returned to its normal stillness, but Padre Pio remained frozen in horror at what he had witnessed. He had seen many souls in his visions, some suffering in purgatory, others rejoicing in heaven. But this was different. This was a soul that had been lost not through weakness or passion or ignorance, but through the subtle poison of spiritual pride. It was a tragedy that could have been prevented at any moment if the man had simply been willing to admit his need. In the weeks that followed, Padre Pio found himself unable to shake the memory of that encounter. He began to see similar patterns everywhere he looked. In the confessional, in his conversations with pilgrims, in his observations of religious life around him. He realized that the man in his vision represented a spiritual disease that was far more common than anyone wanted to admit. Churches were full of people who had confused religious activity with spiritual life, who had mistaken external practices for internal transformation. The vision changed how Padre Pio approached his ministry entirely. He became more urgent in his warnings about spiritual complacency, more insistent that people examine their hearts rather than just their behavior. He began to emphasize that salvation was not something to be earned through religious performance, but received through humble surrender. He warned people that the most dangerous place to be was not in open rebellion against God, but in false security about their spiritual condition. He told his spiritual children that the greatest enemy of true faith was not atheism or immorality, but religious pride. The atheist knew he needed to find God. The immoral person knew he needed to change. But the religiously proud person believed he already had everything he needed. That false confidence became a wall that grace could not penetrate without the person's permission. And too often, that permission never came. Padre Pio began to pray differently after that vision, with a desperate urgency for souls who might be walking the same path as the man he had seen. He offered countless masses for people who appeared faithful on the outside, but might be empty within. He wept for those who sat in church pews week after week, without ever truly encountering the God they claimed to serve. He understood that the most tragic loss was not the soul who rejected God openly, but the soul who believed he was already saved while remaining spiritually dead. The encounter taught him that heaven and hell were not just future destinations, but present realities. The man in his vision had been living in a kind of spiritual hell, even while maintaining his religious practices. He had been separated from God by his pride, even while sitting in God's presence every Sunday. His soul had been dying, even while his religious reputation flourished. What haunted Padre Pio most deeply was the realization that this soul had been given every possible opportunity to recognize his spiritual poverty and turn to God with genuine humility. Throughout his life, he had been surrounded by countless moments of grace. Every homily he heard was an invitation to examine his heart. Every communion he received was an offer of intimate union with Christ. Every confession he made was a chance to move beyond surface sins to the deeper transformation his soul desperately needed. But the man had approached each of these encounters with the same spiritual blindness. He heard sermons as confirmations of his righteousness, rather than calls to deeper conversion. He received communion as a reward for his faithful attendance, rather than as medicine for his spiritual sickness. He went to confession to maintain his clean record, rather than to allow God to heal his wounded heart. Every grace offered had bounced off the armor of his self-satisfaction. Padre Pio began to understand why Christ had spoken so harshly about those who appeared clean on the outside while remaining corrupted within. The vision revealed that religious pride was perhaps the most deadly spiritual condition because it inoculated the soul against its own need for salvation. A person trapped in obvious sins knew something was wrong, but a person trapped in religious complacency felt no urgency, no desperation, no hunger for God. The man in the vision had lived his entire life believing that his external religious practices were proof of his internal spiritual health. He had confused the symptoms of faith with faith itself. He attended church, so he believed he loved God. He followed moral rules, so he believed his heart was pure. He avoided scandal, so he believed he was holy. But none of these external behaviors had ever penetrated to the core of his being where real transformation happens. Padre Pio realized this soul had been like someone who studied medicine extensively, memorized every textbook, passed every exam, but never actually practiced healing. He knew all the religious terminology, followed all the prescribed practices, maintained all the proper appearances, but had never allowed the divine physician to operate on his diseased heart. He had become an expert in the theory of salvation while remaining completely ignorant of its reality. The tragedy deepened as Padre Pio saw how this man's spiritual blindness had infected every relationship in his life. His religious pride had made him impossible to love authentically because he never revealed his true self to anyone. He presented only his carefully crafted spiritual image, never allowing others to see his struggles, his doubts, his genuine need for help. His family and friends knew his religious persona, but had never met his actual soul. Even worse, his false righteousness had made him incapable of truly loving others. He had looked at everyone through the lens of his own supposed spiritual superiority. He judged those who struggled with faith rather than compassion for their journey. He felt irritated by those who asked difficult questions rather than admiration for their honesty. He dismissed those who fell short of his religious standards rather than extending the mercy he himself desperately needed. The vision showed Padre Pio that this soul had spent decades surrounded by people who could have helped him if he had ever admitted his need. His wife had tried to reach his heart through gentle suggestions about being less judgmental. His children had attempted to connect with him beyond their shared religious obligations. His friends had offered friendship that went deeper than surface conversations about church activities. But his pride had kept him isolated within his fortress of false security. Padre Pio watched as the reality of wasted opportunities began to dawn on the soul. He saw moments when God had tried to break through his spiritual complacency through various trials and sufferings, times when illness had threatened to humble him, when losses had created openings for genuine prayer, when difficulties had offered chances to depend on God rather than his own righteousness. But each time, the man had weathered these storms while maintaining his spiritual pride intact. The soul had interpreted every blessing as confirmation of his worthiness rather than as undeserved gift. When things went well in his life, he saw it as reward for his faithful church attendance. When he avoided the troubles that plagued others, he viewed it as evidence of his moral superiority. He had turned every grace into a reason for self-congratulation rather than gratitude, every mercy into proof of his righteousness rather than recognition of his need. What made the encounter even more devastating was seeing how this pattern had accelerated as the man aged. Instead of growing more humble with experience, he had become more convinced of his spiritual achievements. Instead of developing deeper awareness of his need for God, he had grown more satisfied with his religious accomplishments. His years of church attendance had made him feel increasingly entitled to salvation rather than increasingly grateful for mercy. Padre Pio realized that this soul represented the spiritual danger that lurked in every religious community. The temptation to mistake familiarity with sacred things for intimacy with the sacred itself, to confuse religious knowledge with spiritual wisdom, to substitute external conformity for internal transformation, to replace genuine relationship with God with comfortable routine about God. The man had become like someone who worked in a beautiful garden every day but never noticed the flowers. He had been surrounded by the beauty and mystery of faith, but had reduced it all to obligations and achievements. He had taken the poetry of divine love and turned it into a checklist of religious requirements. He had transformed the adventure of spiritual growth into the tedium of spiritual maintenance. As the vision continued, Padre Pio saw the devastating moment when the soul began to understand that all his religious activities had been spiritually meaningless because they had never flowed from love. His church attendance had been habit, not worship. His prayers had been recitations, not conversations. His charitable giving had been obligation, not generosity. His moral behavior had been reputation management, not holiness. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Decades of what he thought were spiritual investments had actually been spiritual emptiness. Years of believing he was growing closer to God had been years of growing more distant through pride. Seasons of thinking he was building treasure in heaven had been seasons of accumulating nothing but religious vanity. His entire spiritual life had been a beautiful facade covering a foundation of sand. Padre Pio witnessed the soul's growing panic as he understood that death had revealed the truth he had spent a lifetime avoiding. All the external religious practices that had given him such confidence were powerless to save him because they had never changed his heart. All the spiritual activities that had made him feel secure were meaningless because they had never been motivated by love. All the religious achievements that had fed his pride were worthless because they had never brought him closer to God. This vision stayed with Padre Pio until his dying day, not as a source of despair, but as an urgent warning for all of us. He saw that the greatest spiritual danger isn't obvious rebellion against God, but the quiet deception of believing we're already saved while our hearts remain untouched by grace. The man in his vision looked holy on Sundays, but holiness that exists only on Sunday isn't holiness at all. It's performance. Padre Pio begged us to examine our hearts, not just our habits, to seek relationship, not just religion, because in the end, God doesn't ask how many times we attended church. He asks whether we ever truly let him in. Don't let religious routine replace genuine surrender. Your soul depends on it.